This is the Sony A9 III, one of the fastest and most intriguing bits of photo technology that I've ever used in my entire life. And this is the Sony A7RV, one of the best cameras that I've ever used in terms of image quality, while still giving you a lot of modern conveniences and incredible autofocus. But which one is actually best for most people? Check it out. Now, this video isn't sponsored by Sony. I've done work with them in the past, but this is completely independent. They have no idea I'm making this video. But it is one of those things where I get a decent amount of questions regarding if someone is going to buy something other than, let's say, the A7 IV, should they go in one of these different directions? So here's kind of where I've decided to have each of these cameras and the reasons why. I'll also say at the time of making this video, I have no idea what could be possibly coming with a potential A7 V, but in terms of the technology and the sensor and stuff that's currently in the A7 IV, that camera is more than enough for the vast majority of people out there. Each of these cameras is going to give you what I would consider to be more conveniences and quality of life improvements, things like that. But there are a very slim population of people that would need one of these cameras over something that the A7 IV already gives you. So if you're maybe thinking about jumping into the Sony ecosystem or moving from mirrorless or anything like that, well, both of these cameras are great. The first and probably better step for the, again, vast majority of people is just going to be the A7 IV. So don't go into this thing going like, oh my gosh, I have to choose between these two. It's just what I have personally ended up with, and that is probably a different use case than a lot of other people, but you can listen to all the reasons why I got these two cameras and make the decision for yourself. But again, I want to stress that, you know, if you're going to be thinking about a modern Sony camera at this point, the A7 IV does the most things that most people are going to need. So don't be swayed into thinking you need to buy like the highest of the highest stuff just because it exists or just because I have it. All right, so in terms of similarities here, there are actually less than you would think. The first bit that was the most kind of revolutionary is this multi-angle kind of flip screen here, where you have the old school photography style flip screen, but then you also have the articulation that moves it out here. So in case you were trying to see yourself, you can obviously see that. But then for me as a photographer, or even when I'm shooting video as not the person in front of the camera, I love having this articulated screen here. Both of these cameras share that screen and they are absolutely fantastic. The resolution here could be better, but I'm not complaining about this at all. Really love both of these. They both share an incredibly high resolution EVF as well. Is both large in terms of magnification and the actual size, but also in terms of the resolution that you're getting out of this. So the experience of looking at either the screen here or the rear LCD screen is going to be fantastic on both of these cameras. And it's honestly a big reason why I think the quality of life improvements over something like the A7 IV are feeling just better in these cameras. But obviously that doesn't mean that the massive price jump between the A7 IV and one of these is going to be worthwhile. Now, I'll also add that I did a complete video comparing the A7R5 with the A7 IV. You can check that out up here if you're not really as interested in the A9 III. But these both actually have really good autofocus. The autofocus engines or algorithms or whatever in here are fantastic. They both have an AI chip that allows them to do better subject tracking and recognition. And I think it's something they call pose estimation. It's just a lot smarter in terms of autofocus. It's not necessarily faster. It's more that the camera just knows exactly where it should be focusing for the most part. It is incredibly rare that I miss focus on either of these cameras, even in a fast sequence. It's just something that I've now taken for granted that if I go and do a shoot or a wedding or anything like that, if I am tracking how I normally do on these cameras, I would legitimately be shocked if I get something out of focus because they are just so good. These cameras also both give you the dual slots, obviously, so having two different card slots for redundancy. but also they give you those combo slots so you can use either an SD or a CF Express Type A card. And those are actually really functional and helpful, especially on either of these cameras. You definitely don't need one in the A7R5 to do everything that you need to do on here, but with the larger file size at 60 megapixels, it is definitely helpful to be able to pull those cards off a lot faster. Now, in terms of differences, we actually do have a pretty substantial amount of differences here. The bodies themselves are actually really different as well. The A7R5 has the pinnacle of the older A7 series designs, while the A9 Mark III definitely has a little bit of an improvement ergonomically. When you're looking at it from the top, you see a lot of similarities in terms of how the buttons are placed and where they're placed, but you can definitely tell that the shutter button here is angled forward a little bit. We have just different spaces where some of the buttons pop out a little bit more, but actually using these cameras back to back is really seamless because all the buttons are still in the same place. So every button is still in the same place. The layout is all the same, but I will say that the A9 Mark III is definitely kind of the future of the Alpha series design because it just feels a little bit better in the hand. They definitely made some ergonomic improvements, but it's one of those things that's more subtle than anything, I guess. Now, outside of the bodies, the thing that's going to be the biggest thing for either of these cameras and is the biggest selling point for both of them, to be honest, as well, is going to be the sensors. The A7R5 has a 60 megapixel sensor, which I used to think is completely overkill, and to some extent it still is, to be honest. Like, a lot of people don't need 60 megapixels, but the flexibility that you get in those files is pretty astounding. You get a lot of dynamic range, and out of a full frame camera, it is some of the best image quality, again, that I've ever used. And even if you don't want to use those 60 megapixels, even the MRAW mode, like the medium raw mode on here, I believe is 26 or 27 megapixels. And so one of the things that is amazing about this camera is that you can shoot this at 26 megapixels, still get incredible image quality, all that stuff. But then also, if you want to use this in APS-C crop mode, it also gives you a 26 megapixel image from the APS-C crop mode just because the sensor has that many megapixels in it. So it's a way that you can really easily kind of extend your lens lineup, especially if you are packing tight or anything like that. You could put a longer lens on here or even like a 50 millimeter lens and punch in and get a 75 millimeter focal length equivalent. Now, because it's 60 megapixels, it's definitely a little bit slower. You're definitely not going to use the electronic shutter in here because the sensor just reads out so slow from top to bottom that it gives you some warping. I'm not going to get into a ton about video here, but I have actually shot a lot of my talking head videos on this camera because I've used the XLR top handle from the FX3 and used that because it just still gives you really good quality at 4K 24, but it does have crops at 4K 60. It can give you 8K if you really want to, but that makes the sensor even slower. So I think that at 24 frames a second, it's really good, but again, you get a lot of that kind of like weird warping stuff in the camera. So I wouldn't make this a primary video camera, but it's definitely a camera that if you are primarily a photographer and you also want to have some really, really good video specs, it works out really well. And again, I've shot a lot of my YouTube videos on this combo or even the A7CR, which shares the same sensor. Now, for kind of the polar opposite, we have the A9III. The big headline here is that it has a global shutter sensor, meaning that you're not going to get any of that weird warping or jello effect or rolling shutter because the shutter reads out instantaneously every single pixel. That being said, it comes at the cost of a little bit of dynamic range and a little bit of sensitivity. The base ISO in photo mode here is 250, which is fairly high, but you also get a shutter speeds of up to 1/80,000th of a second. So I haven't noticed that being an issue at all in practice, really. But also in video mode, the base ISO for S-Log3, which gives you the most dynamic range, the most flexibility, is ISO 2000. So yeah, it's definitely something that you're going to have to deal with a little bit if it's a camera you're looking into. Now, one of the ways that I've gone about kind of remedying that is I saw a video about these filters that you can actually put in front of the sensor from a brand called Kalari. And I can actually confirm that these filters also work in the A9III as well as in the A7 bodies. So the same sensor, little things here. It is just a tiny, tiny little thing that you actually put in front of your sensor. And then that essentially just reduces the amount of light that's getting to your sensor, making your shutter speeds and everything more relative to what another camera would be, depending on what obviously filter you put in there. But if you're someone like myself that also does some kind of a hybrid photo video work, it's something that you might want to look into. Now, as a hybrid photo video camera, I actually use this as my primary camera when we took our trip to Scandinavia. All of the video stuff that I shot was on the A9III. I also shot a bunch of the video stuff from a recent elopement on the A9III. And I would honestly say the only big disadvantage is that higher ISO, base ISO at ISO 2000. And so if you can get around that with ND filters or these ND filters that go either in front of the lens or in front of the sensor, this thing actually puts out some really, really good video and some really good video specs as well. Obviously, the global shutter is something that is going to be a huge kind of in-demand thing for filmmakers. It also shoots everything completely uncropped, so uncropped 4K 120, uncropped 4K 60, which also makes this a really good hybrid photo video camera if you are someone that's doing weddings and you want to go back and forth between shooting stills and maybe shooting 4K 60. I know a lot of people that are doing kind of the hybrid thing are shooting everything in 4K 60. So this camera makes that setup super, super easy. This thing feels just like a mix between a really high-end photo camera and a really high-end video camera. One of the other big standout features here is the fact that it can shoot 120 photos per second as well in quick little bursts. So I've done a lot of these. If you follow me on Instagram, you've seen multiple of these. I did one of these for a proposal. I did some of these at Sony Condo with one of the models, just throwing her veil up in the air. And there's a lot of really, really cool stuff that you can do to kind of mix between the mediums of photo and video. And with just how incredible the autofocus is in this thing, like you're not missing frames here either, even when people are moving, even at 120 photos per second, which is, again, just absolutely bonkers. And then the last like big standout feature of the A9III over pretty much every other camera on the market is the fact that you can do flash sync at any shutter speed. So obviously it's going to depend on how much light a speed light or something or a strobe is going to be able to put out. But most cameras have a relatively low flash sync speed. And with something like HSS, you can kind of overcome that, but you're losing a lot of the flash power. But with this, you're getting a lot more of that flash power because you can sync up to that exact speed at, again, any shutter speed. It definitely makes shooting off camera and even on camera strobe stuff just so much easier, not having to either put NDs on or stop down or anything else like that with dealing with HSS. So if you're someone that does a lot of off camera or strobe work, this is clearly a camera to check out. Now, there are obviously a lot of differences here. The A7RV does have a lot better dynamic range. It just does. Does the A9III have bad dynamic range? No. But will I be choosing to use the A7RV when I'm doing more landscape stuff and maybe some wider stuff when I need the most dynamic range possible? Sure. And then I'll use the A9III for maybe some tighter things and stuff where maybe that dynamic range doesn't come into effect as much. I also find that the autofocus on both of these is, again, absolutely fantastic. But if I want to do some weird mixed media stuff, obviously I'm going to be choosing the A9III here. And if I'm going to want to take a camera that can do both high-end photo and video, this is definitely going to be like the one-size-fits-all kind of thing for me at this point. And again, I am completely speculating here. I have zero information about any future product releases. But in shooting both of these together, one of these with high image quality and a high resolution sensor, and one of these with a lower resolution sensor, but a lot of speed and versatility and capability, it does make me really think that I'm wondering if shoving these two cameras together is sort of what the new A1 Mark II is going to be. And it's making me pretty excited about what that potential camera could be, considering if you could take a lot of the specs from this camera and put a lot of the same specs with this camera and combine them into one. I think you might be getting close to making the perfect camera for me. So let me know your thoughts. Let me know if you prefer one over the other. I would say that, again, most people don't need anything more than the A7 IV. I would also say that most wedding photographers probably are going to be good to go with an A7R5. It is really versatile in the ways that a lot of people like myself shoot, but I do know a lot of people that are doing more hybrid stuff, some photo video together. And then again, obviously all my friends that do a lot of strobe work and off-camera flash work are just like obsessed with the A9III. So let me know which one kind of like suits your style more in the comments down below. Let me know if you have any questions as well. Check out my original video on the A9III up here. Check out my video on the A7R5 up here, and I will see you in one of those videos.